webinar. All right, perfect. So once again, thank you everybody to making the time during your day, morning, or evening to join us here for our Promote Your Podcast webinar. My name is John. I am the head of marketing here for Podbean. And over in the chat, you're going to have my coworker, Ronnie, who's going to be hanging out, answering any questions that you may have during the webinar. Please make sure that your chat is set to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, we won't be able to see your question during the webinar. Now, this is one of the many webinars that Podbean hosts. And if you have been part of some of our other webinars, you may notice that we do some webinars which are pretty content heavy on what Podbean provides. And then there are a lot of webinars that we do which are about the podcast industry in general. This one's going to be more in that vein. So while we will be talking about some things that Podbean as a hosting company does provide, we are going to be speaking about ways that no matter what host you're on, no matter what your podcast is about, you have the ability to promote your podcast and get as many ears on your podcast and as many eyes on your product as possible. So if there are any questions, obviously, please let us know in the chat. So the goals that we have laid out for today's webinar are to uncover a variety of different tools that you can use to maximize your exposure, not limited to email lists and social media. We're also going to talk about what a campaign is and how you can develop a campaign strategy to help keep your content in line and make sure that you have a game plan for any marketing that comes up. You also want to have an understanding of how you can have your content in so many different places, but also have an understanding of what your personal bandwidth is. And we'll go ahead and get into what personal bandwidth is here in a little bit. The tools that we will be talking about from Podbean are Podbean social share tools and our analytics and time of day statistics. So these are tools that'll help you stay consistent and help make sure that you have your podcast going up at specific times that will make the most sense for your specific market. And we're going to be talking about sponsors, advertising, and cross promotion. And as an amendment to all this, or as an addition, why you need to have a media kit or a press kit if you're really taking your podcast seriously and what that can really do for you. We're also going to be talking about a content calendar, how to stay consistent with your posting, and how to make sure that you are just generally consistent with everything that you're doing. We're going to be talking here for about 50 minutes or so. I'm going to be speaking predominantly for about 40 minutes or so, and I'm going to leave about 10 minutes at the end for any questions and answers that you may have. So a little bit about who we are. We've been in the podcast hosting game since about 2006. And what a podcast host is basically where you can upload your podcast and do a myriad of different things with your podcast. Really with us, anything that you'd want to do with your podcast, Podbean gives you the ability to do, whether that's a podcast that you're running for wellness, whether that's being a podcast where you just want to put out yourself into the world, whether you want to bring podcasting into the business world for internal communications and training purposes. We also offer a variety of different options for you to monetize your podcast, and we have a podcast live streaming and remote recording platform. So really, anything that you want to do with a podcast, we give you the ability to do. And while it says 380,000 hosted podcasts as of right now, we are actually at about 470,000 to 480,000 hosted podcasts within our platform. So let's just jump in and get started. So we talk all the time about we would love to have our podcast in as many ears and have as many eyes on what we're pushing as possible. But where do you start when it comes to the world of podcasting? There's so many ways to promote. There's obviously posting on social media, there's advertising, there's directories, there's videos that you can create. There's a myriad of different ways. But the number one place I will always recommend starting with is making sure that you have your podcast in as many podcast directories as possible. Now, a podcast directory is a place that people can search your podcast and they'll be able to come across information, or in many cases, they'll be able to actually play your podcast and subscribe to you, leave comments and things like that as well. The top 3 directories I will always recommend being in are Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and the Podbean app. I'll put in the 4th. But all of those are absolutely the top 3 that you want to be in. Realistically, when you publish a podcast episode, if you're hosting with Podbean and you publish it, it gets posted to Podbean. However, if you have submitted your RSS feed to the different directories, such as Apple Podcasts, then as soon as you press that publish button, your podcast is going to get pushed to these other directories as well. So really, there's dozens and dozens and hundreds of different directories that your podcast could be part of. But what you're doing is you're giving yourself the ability to have a lot of visibility for your podcast at the click of one button. And what you're doing is you're letting your audio and you're letting your hosting company do a lot of that work for you. A lot of the times we often think of our podcast hosts simply as the people that take the audio file and put it out to the world. And that's exactly how you should think of one facet of the hosting. But make sure that you're on all three of these different platforms. We actually just released a brand new interface, if you're with us a few days ago, that'll help you get on Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts really easily. But towards the end of the webinar, we'll also go ahead and link a blog post that we have about submitting your podcast to the various directories. So this is definitely one that I'll recommend. And the reason why I say that in some cases you'll be able to have them played is there are directories that you can submit to as well, which are text only. Like, for example, IMDb just released new content to where you can have your podcast listed in IMDb, which is mostly for movies and film and things like that. So I think that with that, just as many places as you can have your podcast can only help you. And especially with places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, where you're talking about playlisting and you're talking about new and noteworthy and ways that you can get even more visibility, the more places that your podcast lives, the better. So we're going to go ahead and go over a quick demo of some of the Podbean social share tools that we have as part of our platform here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share here. And I'm going to share my personal podcast with everybody. Okay, now does everybody see my screen okay? It should say dashboard. All right, beautiful. So what we have here is we have our main dashboard. If you're familiar with Podbean and you're hosting with Podbean, this is what you log into, and it'll give you the first few statistics, but we're not looking at that for right now. What we're going to be looking at here is our social share, and you can find that under distribution and social share here. So what social share allows you to do is, just as if you submit your RSS feed to various directories and your podcast gets pushed there, with this, you have the ability to have your podcast episode push out to various social media channels in a myriad of different ways. So you can connect your podcast to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Tumblr, and WordPress. I believe we still are doing a little bit of troubleshooting with Tumblr, but what should be able to happen is your podcast will, in one way or another, get pushed to these various directories. What I like about Facebook and YouTube is, with Facebook and YouTube, you have the ability to have an automatically generated image video podcast pushed to those various directories. So for example, if you ended up having your podcast and you're like, oh, I'd love to be able to get it on YouTube. If you have YouTube enabled on your social share, Podbean will create a still image video that has your audio synced up to it that then gets pushed to your specific YouTube channel. Now, the podcast that I run is a wrestling podcast with 5 other hosts called the Armchair Bookers Podcast. And we talk about all different kinds of wrestling, from WWE to AEW to just all the different kinds of wrestling that are out there. And what happens is, if I, for example, go to up at the top right corner and I click on this edit button here, it'll ask me what pages I'd like to auto share the podcast to. So you can share to a variety of different pages on your Facebook. And Facebook actually gives you this option here to post either a link to your podcast or to upload a video to your timeline. Now, this option I always like going over, because what you choose to do is really based on how you use our service. If you upload the video as a timeline, you're taking advantage of Facebook's algorithm. A lot of the times, if you post a link to something external, Facebook is going to cut your traffic down pretty hard. But Facebook really loves it when people upload content to their network. So if you click upload video as a timeline, that video is going to get pushed over to Facebook and you can get more visibility on it. The post link I like because for my podcast, there's a lot of things that we speak about in the wrestling industry. We have a lot of things for donations on our page. We have a lot of different things that we actually use the Podbean page for. So we want people to be able to click on that link, go to our page, and while they'll be able to listen to the podcast anyway, they'll also be able to view our webpage also. Now, we also have this header here for Twitter. If we click on this edit button, now I'm clicking on edit because I've already established these, but if you haven't done it before, then you'll see that little plus sign to the right-hand column that you set up your various social media with. With Twitter, you have the ability to create a note that'll go out whenever you have a new episode that's published. So if I don't get the opportunity to post about a brand new episode we have, this is the display note that will go out on our Twitter feed. And this I can include hashtags with already. So it makes it really easy to make sure that no matter what we do, we have an episode coming out that's going to be pushed to the various social media. LinkedIn will automatically share your post to your timeline, and WordPress will embed the podcast player on your WordPress site. With YouTube, the disclaimer I will always put out there is what happens with YouTube does depend on the kind of Podbean subscription that you have. YouTube does have a variety of API restrictions that they impose on us. So with YouTube, you can, if you have an unlimited audio account, you can have it pushing once every week, so once every 7 days. If you are on Unlimited Plus, you can have an auto-generated video pushed every 24 hours. But the thing about this is this helps what we call our personal bandwidth. So how much time in a day, in a month, in a week do you have to actually share all of your content across social media? This here allows you to take a little bit of that workload away from what you manually have to do. And you know that your podcast is always going to be pushed onto these various sites here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my other screen here. So just to make sure, does everybody see my screen okay? We should be back at Podbean social share features. All right, cool. So the next thing I always bring up too, and the way that I kind of break up this entire webinar is really talking about things that are at everybody's disposal and within everybody's hands. And the next thing we talk about here is social media. And we all know what social media really is. We know social media accounts that we're on. We know what we use to interact with friends, family, businesses. And we have a variety of different things. We have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have Snapchat, we have TikTok now. There are hundreds of apps being developed for specific markets each and every day. But at the core, the reason why people need social media and the reason why it's really powerful to promote your podcast is social media gives people the ability to engage with each other around content that they either agree, disagree, or find entertaining. So really at its core, social media, as we talk about at the bottom, is the ability for people to share their content, to be social with each other, and to also share content that's been created. So when we think about social media, we really want to take that into consideration. And you really want to think about the amount of time that people spend on social media day to day. There was a study done that there's about 144 minutes a day that are spent on social media, and that was in 2019. Now, in 2020, with us being in a bit of a lockdown in all the various parts of the globe, you could assume that that may be going up too. And a channel that has that much engagement, you want to see about how you can maximize that. And we're going to go over some strategies in which you can use social media to grow your podcast momentarily here. But one thing that I love about social media in promoting your podcast is it gives you the ability to add that community and engagement that you wouldn't get from another way. So when most people upload a podcast, it's mostly an audio recording, whether it's you and an interviewee or whatever your podcast is about, someone listens to it, and that's really as far as it goes. They don't get to really engage with you. They don't really get to engage with the content past that unless they're trying to talk to a friend, talk to a family member. But with social media, you have the ability to create forums. You have the ability to have people speak about the content, share your content, and get even more about your message. It creates conversation around your content. And even on top of that, the more social media you have and the more websites that you have, the more you can tie back to your brand, the more SEO and SERP traffic you can build for your podcast. Now, with SEO, for those who aren't familiar with those kinds of terms, SEO stands for search engine optimization. And all you have to do is go on Google and search SEO, and you'll come up with a variety of different explanations, tools, and tactics on how to develop this. There's a tool that we use pretty frequently called Moz, MOZ.com, which is really great for helping you develop SEO when you come up with descriptions and write-ups for your whatever it is, a blog, a podcast, whatever. So the more social media you have and the more you can make it about your brand, the more funneling you're going to get when someone looks up specific keywords, specific topics, and what have you. Now, with SEO, the question we usually get the follow-up of is, can I SEO my descriptions for my podcast? And yes, we actually have a blog and a Podcasting Smarter episode that we released speaking to Amy Whitney of Real English Conversations. She gets about 2 million, she's had about 2 million downloads as of right now, and she uses this as a driver for a lot of her content. Ronnie, if you wouldn't mind, whether now or in a little bit, if you could link to that blog post down in the chat. But one thing that you'll see that we talk about is how to reverse engineer successful competitor SEO. So if you see a description that's working really well for somebody, what can you do to develop that? What can you do to take from that and use that to help develop your podcast? And Ronnie just posted that down in the chat. So thank you, Ronnie. Now, the thing you also want to consider is, what does each social media channel offer, right? Facebook gives you the ability to build community. It gives you the ability to do a lot of engagement building. Instagram is something where it's images and videos and, you know, really engaging content, but becomes a bit more difficult to build that kind of discord, right? But when you talk about something like Twitter, you got 280 characters, you got to say your piece, and that's it. So what social media channels seem enjoyable to you, and how are you going to use your social media channels? What you can do, and what I think is really smart with a lot of podcasters, is they'll look at their social media channels in different ways. And there may be some that they favor over others. For the podcast that I run, we favor Instagram and Facebook pretty heavily, because with the wrestling, we have a lot of engagement. We have a lot of opinions. We have a lot of people who want to say what they thought of specific matches and specific promotions. Twitter doesn't give you the ability to do that for what we look to do. But that's how we use it. We use Instagram and whatnot to post really poignant parts of our podcast using what we call audiograms. So maybe a video that's about 30 to 90 seconds that has a little wave bar going through it, making it a really engaging piece of content. That's usually an Instagram piece. But then on our Facebook, we may say, hey, what did you think of this match? What do you think about this show? And if you really create places for each of your social media channels, you have the ability to grow your podcast in a way you didn't have before. Now, when we talk about personal bandwidth, also, you have to understand that personal bandwidth is the amount that you can actually do in a day. With my podcast, we have 5 hosts, so it's easy for us to delegate responsibilities across 4 hosts, 5 hosts. But when you talk about a lot of podcasts, a lot of this is a solo game. A lot of this is you going on the website. A lot of this is you recording. A lot of this is you basically doing all the work. The reason why I bring up the tools like our the social share tools, Facebook's scheduling posts, Twitter's TweetDeck, is because these things help you schedule things in advance. These things also help you automate a lot of the work that you would have to manually do otherwise. So it'll help you keep consistency across whether it's social media or posting your content. And one tool that I'll always recommend for this is Hootsuite. Hootsuite is a really, really powerful tool that not only can schedule one piece of social media, but can schedule many. So it's really worth looking into that in order to help you keep consistency. What I do is at the beginning of each week, what I'll do is I'll go on to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and I'll use Hootsuite to help schedule out the content for the week. And then there are other things, obviously, I can do, but really that's the crux of that. Again, use audiograms. Audiograms are those short videos with text that give you about 30 to 90 seconds to give a really poignant part of your podcast. That's something that I will always, always, always recommend doing. And again, look for the options to give questions and polls to people. People love giving their opinion, whether that be in text, whether that be over the phone, whether that be on Podbean Live when you run a live stream. No matter what it is, people love giving their opinion on a specific matter. And polls really help that. Questions really help that. One thing I'll always recommend everybody have also is a content calendar. A content calendar basically gives you the ability to organize your releases, whether that be your podcast or content for marketing. So really what you can do is, let's say we use Monday to Sunday. And what you do is you have one column that shows all the social media channels and all of the posting and all of the creative outlets that you do. And what you can do is you can go through that content calendar and mark off how many times per day you're going to post to it. So if you know you're going to post, let's say, one podcast every week, then you can mark that on the day. For example, we release podcasts on Sunday. We have a podcast marked for Sunday. Then on social media, we're promoting it through the week. Let's say we post on social media 2 or 3 times. This is a way that you can go ahead and make sure that you at least have some level of organization with your content. And that's going to help people also build faith in the brand that you're putting out there. Now, the next thing we talk about is a mailing list. When it comes to a mailing list becomes a direct line to your most dedicated listeners. And I wasn't really a fan of a mailing list for years. With mailing lists, though, it becomes probably one of the most important ways to build your audience. When you have a mailing list, because it's the most direct line to your most dedicated listeners, you are not competing with any other algorithms, right? So consider things like social media. As great as social media is, you are posting as well as the other 2,000 friends you have on your Facebook and Instagram account. So these things have algorithms to put content that's more, let's say, engaging to them, at least, in front of people that may be following you or friending you or whatnot. But with a mailing list, you have the ability to be right in somebody's inbox. It's easily searchable in a listener's inbox, and you have really cool customization options you have. You know, with Facebook, with all these social medias, you're still on their site. So it's predominantly their branding, and hey, you're there too. But with a mailing list, you have the ability to make the branding as close to your branding as physically possible. And again, when you have a mailing list, you want to keep in mind that what if social media goes down? What if these different platforms go down and you don't have another way to reach out to your fans, to your listeners? You will, with a mailing list, have people's emails, sometimes a name, sometimes extra information too. So you'll always have a lifeline connected to your most dedicated fan base. Now, we talk about how do you develop a mailing list, right? You could have a podcast with only a few listeners. You could have a podcast with hundreds of thousands of listeners, which we've seen recently from everyone posting about their downloadership that we sent out. So thank you all for posting about that. That's super cool. And I'm glad to see the success of everybody. But what you can do to build your mailing list is run contests. You know, give reason for people to join your mailing list. Maybe partner up with a company that's like-minded or a like-minded podcast. See if there's a way that you can give discounts to people for a specific product if they join your mailing list. Develop reasons for people to join your mailing list originally. And what you can do is you can create that buzz. What's really cool about developing a mailing list too is, especially if you're using MailChimp, which integrates with Podbean, you'll be able to have your podcasts automatically sent out via MailChimp when they launch. So for example, if we launched this morning, actually, we released our Wednesday Night War, which we talk about WWE and NXT, their Wednesday shows, or WWE and AEW, sorry. And what happens is when we launched that episode this morning, anyone who's part of our mailing list got an email that it's live. So that will even help raise listenership for your specific podcast. Another solution that I recommend is Constant Contact. MailChimp and Constant Contact are both great. I've used both of them before and I have nothing but good things to say about them. But that being said, MailChimp does have the integration with Podbean. So these are two things that you can definitely look into. And a mailing list is super important for you to develop your audience. And a lot of these things that we talk about also, if you have other ventures outside of podcasting, you can also use a lot of these marketing tactics for that. And remember, it's not just about the people that you're trying to get that haven't listened to your podcast yet, you're also looking to speak to your internal audience, right? The people that already know about your podcast and the people that are starting to follow you, right? So using our tools like Podbean's downloads by time of day and understanding where your audience comes from, you can learn about the various trends of your audience. If your podcast is something that's localized, for example, if your podcast is something that focuses simply on the tri-state area, let's say in the US, or if your podcast is something that speaks to everybody everywhere, you can use these two tools to really get granular and make sure that you're posting at times that are the strongest for people to engage with your content. But people subscribe to my podcast. Why would the time of day matter? This is true, that people do subscribe to your podcast. That being said, there's a lot of things that all of us do day to day. But sometimes you may see an episode pop up, you may see a podcast pop up, and you're like, okay, cool, I'll check it later. Later never comes. So if you are able to really learn about the trends of your audience using these tools, you can make sure that when your podcast episode launches, you have the highest chance of activating your audience to listen to your podcast. And you don't just have to use our tools. You can use social media's different trends to help develop strategies also. So for example, let's say you have a strong listenership on Sunday at 3 p.m. of active listeners downloading your newest podcast, but you notice on social media, 6 p.m. is the time that people are starting to engage with that. What you can do is you can post on your social media, hey, I have a new episode, go check it out. You already know that your audience is going to be activated to listen at their strong time. But maybe you have that one piece of strong content, that one piece of captivating content that people are going to go to, and that's going to help draw audience. Maybe you don't post that at 3 p.m. Maybe you post that on social media at 6 p.m. So what you're doing is you're using all of the different social media tools and analytics that you have to really maximize the amount of engagement that you're going to get with your content. And the next thing that we talk about here is really about advertisers, sponsors, cross-promotion, and how to create a campaign for your podcast here. So in brief, and by the way, I put a lot of content on these slides. I don't usually read just off of them. But if there is anybody who's trying to, let's say, hey, am I going to be able to get the slides later? We send the video within about 24 to 48 hours. So you can always go back, pause it. The content is yours. So with advertising and sponsorships, are you looking to promote your specific episode, or are you looking to promote a specific goal? Remember, advertising is really targeted marketing about specific products or services. So if you are considering promoting your podcast, you want to take into consideration, is my content that's generally able to be accessed no matter what time, no matter what month, no matter what year? Is it evergreen content? Is it content that people can always get something out of 3-4 months down the line? Or is it a podcast that is generally time sensitive? You know, with one of the episodes that we have, the Wednesday Night Wars, once that episode is over, people don't usually need to go back to it. It's not evergreen content. It's very time sensitive. So in the advertising, what are you promoting? How do you see your podcast? And what is your strategy for your successful podcast? Also, when it comes to sponsorships, we often think about how to get them, how to receive them, and what sponsorships are. Sometimes sponsorships are not financially based. Sometimes they are simply promotional, but I can't tell you how many promotional opportunities we've had that have really helped grow our podcast. And myself, I am a musician of about 15 years also. There are a lot of sponsorships that I have with different instrument companies that have helped me get in front of eyes and in front of people that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So there are definitely financial sponsorships that you should look into by sending out a media and a press kit. More to come on that shortly. But remember, not all promotion, not all cross promotion, not all sponsorships are paid. And speaking about that, when we talk about cross promotion, when you find like-minded businesses or you find like-minded podcasters, it's a really smart idea for you to develop this cross promotional relationship. Simultaneously promote each other's products on each social media. If there's a podcaster that has a big audience and you want to do some cross collaboration, you can run their ads on your show and vice versa. co-host each other's shows, talk about each other on each other's shows. There's a lot that you can do that can really establish that. And one thing that we have is Podbean's ads marketplace. Some of you may be familiar with running ads on your own podcast, but you can actually, if you go to sponsorship.podbean.com, you can create a separate account and you can run your own audio ads on other podcasts. So that's a really powerful way for you to go in, look at the listenership, and look at the geo-targeting and the keywords of various podcasts that are on our platform, and run advertising to a market that you know is targeted for your specific style of podcast and your specific genre. Now, we often get asked also about creating a launch plan or a marketing campaign. So it's great. We have advertising, we have sponsorships, we have cross promotion, we have a lot of things. But what is a marketing campaign? Really, it's a specific goal or product for a duration of time that's being promoted, right? So how long do you plan to promote your podcast for, or a specific facet of it? What is your campaign going to focus on? You know, you want to think about these specific things that you're promoting. You could just promote your podcast. Hey, listen to me, it's great. But there's a lot of consideration around going, okay, pre-planning what your episodes are going to be about. Maybe if you're going to be at a big conference and you want to go ahead and promote around that, what content can you create? So for the example that I give here is, let's say you have a big interview coming up. You can create a variety of content that highlights the person coming onto your show, but will also lead back to your podcast, right? So let's say the person that you're interviewing is known for a specific thing. So for example, let's say this. Let's say that the person that I interview is a big time wrestler for AEW. And I go, you know what? I want to go ahead and I want to talk about what they've done. You can post to some of their interviews before, some of their specific matches, some things like that. But you can create content also. Like one thing that we do is we pit two wrestlers from different companies against each other. So one thing that we do for a marketing campaign is we'll say, for example, okay, this wrestler versus this wrestler, who wins? That inspires that engagement. But it's always tagged with our logos, and it's always tagged for people to come back to us, so that by the time we release that interview, we have the ability to grow an audience around what we're doing. So think of things like that. And actually, when you go to Ads Marketplace, it'll show you and ask you how long you would like a specific marketing campaign to be launched for. Now, one of the last pieces of content that we speak about here is why you need a media kit. If you're part of the music industry, it's also called a press kit. But in general, media kit, press kit is all one and the same. What is it at the end of the day? You use your media kit to secure advertisers and sponsors, to bring on new guests, to speak at a variety of conferences, for media ops, whatever the case may be. Really, it's a document that you can give to potential advertisers and give to potential people that you want to work with within the industry, that highlights what your podcast is about, your downloadership and your statistics, strong testimonials about your podcast, your contact information on every single page of your media kit. Please put your contact information on every part of your media kit. It's super helpful, and it's going to make sure that people have your contact information no matter what. But the media kit is a professionally delivered way that you can send to people that you want to work with within your given industry, and that they can see the content that you want them to see, right? People ask all the time, can I use social media as a media press kit? And I usually say no. You can link to your social media in your press kit, but you don't want to use your social media as your press kit. Again, with social media, there's a lot of branding that's not you. And there's a lot of things on social media which, you know, may not accurately reflect what you do. You may have a strong listenership over on your podcast. You may not have a strong social media following up front. You may have some people having a pretty heated conversation over there that you might not want advertisers to necessarily see up front. The media kit will allow you to deliver the information that you want advertisers, sponsors, and guests, or whoever you're sending it to see. People will also ask, I have a website. Can I use a website? You sure can. A website is a very powerful tool that can also act as a media or press kit. I will also always recommend having a PDF version of a media kit though, because again, with your website, if you're doing any sorts of maintenance, if something happens, if the server goes down, then people still can't access it. Meanwhile, you can always email a PDF to somebody and they can access it offline. So you can totally use your website, that's fine, but always have at least a PDF version of it too. Years ago, people used to have like the paper versions of it, and at conferences, they used to hand them out to people, or they used to have one that you can simply just like show people during, let's say, big conferences, but that's totally cool too. But I would always say, if you're thinking about having a website, still have a PDF version of it. And we'll go ahead and we'll link to the demo media kit at the end of our webinar here. Now, the last thing that we speak about here is getting creative with your marketing as well. Remember, we talk about the nuts and bolts. We talk about social media, campaigns, all that, but you really want to think of marketing also that's unique and creative and specific to your brand and podcast, right? So I'll always go back to ours, right? So if you're a wrestling podcast, you can create brand-centric fun merch, right? Create shirts that have your logo on it, obviously. Things that you say on the show, which are funny or could be captivating. You know, make specific merch for that. Make wrestling belts that people can buy with the podcast logo. Remember, a lot of marketing is also about branding. So you want people to see your logo and know what it is, exactly what it is, what they can expect. And for people that know, you want them to feel a kinship with your brand. So fun merch can help draw eyes. And again, even something like shirts. Everyone's like, well, everybody has shirts. Yeah, there's a reason why. Because everybody has shirts, everybody has the ability to have their brand out there and people wear the shirts out. Also, for big events, host a live stream for it. Make it a big deal. Host a Zoom chat for it. Host in-person meetups. Hold listening parties. You know, maybe you could partner with a local restaurant and see if you can have a listening party there as well. There's a lot of different things you can do. QR codes are extremely powerful nowadays and extremely popular. Anyone with an iOS device can simply open up their camera, scan a QR code, and be directed to whatever website you want them to go to. I always put the hang flyers locally at like branded events also because people still go out, even in 2020 right now. But if you have flyers that tell about your content and also have a QR code, that's super powerful. And again, it's another way that you can just get your brand out there. I put create a street team here, but really you could consider this either creating a street team of your most dedicated followers to help you promote. Again, there's no better promotion than word of mouth also. You can also think about this as activating your current audience, right? If you have a lot of people that you know that listen to your podcast, ask them to post around on social media. Ask them to post around with stickers. Ask them to do a little bit of that promotional legwork with you, and not for you, but with you. You know, your top fans who believe in your message and believe about what you're talking about are usually more than willing to help out. And there can be little things that you do for that too, like we spoke about with the mailing list, right? You can give incentives for people to have an investment in your street team. And one thing that Ronnie brought up, which I think is a great thing, is creating a social media badge. So if you know somebody or you yourself are somebody with the Photoshop skills or the Pixelmator skills, create a badge that your listeners and followers can post on their various websites. As you saw, and as many of you have posted, like we talked about earlier in the hour, with the downloader badges that many of you have been posting, you can take and you can create a badge that's specific to your podcast that people who are followers of your podcast can post on social media, can post on their own images, can post on social, I said social media, but create an image that people can post over on these various outlets. Again, you can get really creative. It's not super crazy to make those badges either. And if you really need help creating something like that, Fiverr.com is great. And there are a lot of great digital design artists that can create something specific for your brand. Now, before I open it up to any questions here, over on the left-hand side are a variety of Podbean-based resources. Podbean.com is where you can find anything about us. And that URL needs to be shortened for the Podbean webinars. You could just go to podbean.com/webinars, and you can register for all of the different upcoming webinars that we have coming up. We have a bunch on how to bring podcasting into business. We have a bunch on just a variety of different things, how to promote as you're here for, how to record, how to start, how to bring podcasting into the business environment. Really, anything you could want to do with a podcast, we have a webinar for, and we're continuing to create more content as time goes on. And if you liked what you heard today, please feel free to go ahead and post over on social media about the webinars that we had today. Feel free to tag us. We will retweet you in your podcast as well. Over on YouTube, we have a bunch of different help videos. You can always contact me at johnk@podbean.com. And we have a variety of different third-party resources over at podbean.com/site/resources that you can go to, and you can get different discounts on different things. If there's a service that we don't provide, such as transcription, Resources has a great bunch of people that you can look into for that. Over on the right-hand side, there are a bunch of third-party solutions as we spoke about, plus the link for you to be able to download the example media kit. We also have MailChimp.com, which is the website for MailChimp as we spoke about. In order to rock out on Ads Marketplace and run your own ads on specific podcasts, you can go to sponsorship.podbean.com. Remember again, with sponsorship.podbean.com, you have to create a separate login if you're with Podbean already. And we talked about audiograms. We talked about those videos a few times. Headliner.app is a really great tool that you can use to create those videos that are those short clips for your podcast. And you could put wave forms, you could put images with it, you could put links back to your podcast. Really, Headliner is a great tool, and I would recommend doing that. Anything we ever promote in these podcasts and these webinars are not paid sponsorships either. So these are things that anyone who makes and runs the webinar are just speaking about as well. That being said, I will go ahead and open it up here for any questions that you may have. And thank you, Ronnie, for running the chat. Please, everyone, give a warm thank you to Ronnie for running the chat. I couldn't do it without them. Oh, and if you do have any questions for me, please feel free in the Q&A section to drop your questions. Okay, so Mike is asking a question about music podcasts here. So this is a little bit outside of the promotion webinar here, but what they said is that they're a DJ submitting to Spotify, but while after they removed it from the platform, they said that it breaks the rules, but they don't say how it breaks the rules. I will go ahead and give just a brief example here. Okay, sorry. I will just, I won't really speak too much about this yet. I will loop you in with support. Just feel free, email me, johnk@podbean.com, and I'll get you looped up with support so they can give you some more information on this. But the generality of it is make sure that any music that you have is music that you have the rights to in one way or another. Make sure that you have the proper licenses to use the music on any of your podcasts. It can be a little bit tricky to get that sometimes. I know Spotify's been a little bit aggressive now when it comes to RIAA and coming to that kind of content. So definitely shoot me an email, johnk@podbean.com, and we'll go ahead and get you looped up with support today. David Lee asks, if you upload a video file for your podcast episode, will it share to YouTube? Great question. Thank you for asking, because I don't get to talk about that enough. So really good question there. So if you have your Unlimited Plus plan with Podbean, Unlimited Plus is there's a free tier, there's the Unlimited Audio, and then Unlimited Plus is the tier after that. On that tier, you can upload a video podcast. And if you do upload a video podcast, it should, yes. So if you upload a video podcast with Podbean on the Unlimited Plus plan, that should push out to YouTube, yes. And Robert Bianchi asks, do you have a sample of an effective social media badge? Good question. I will always refer you to, many of you are probably familiar with this, the follow us on Spotify or listen on Apple Podcasts or listen on Apple Music badges that Apple and Spotify put out. It's got their logo and it's got a small little text, listen to us over here, right? It's short, effective, and to the point. But what I'll say is if you were trying to direct people, I wouldn't say that you have a badge that says follow me everywhere or follow me here. What I would say is take that kind of model. Take your logo and put it in, I would say, what is it? Like, let's say a 600 by 150 box or rounded edges. And what you can do is you can put your logo, put the name of your podcast, or even just if your logo is long ways, do it like that. But yeah, there's a bunch of different ways that you can do social media badges. You even, for many people on our social media, if you go over there now, you'll see a bunch of people that are posting those download badges that say 100,000, 5,000, a million. Look at those also. Those are relatively sizable. Those I made it at 3,000 by 3,000 pixels, but when you download them, they're at 400 by 400. The tech team did a great job of shrinking them. So however you decide to get creative, really you're making a badge that people can post anywhere. You don't have to do anything crazy in terms of follow us everywhere, but maybe something you could do, for example, is you could say, listen to your podcast, and then have the logo, right? So listen to, and then the image of your podcast. Email me also, and we'll go over some different examples there also. Ellie says headliner. Headliner is great. And Mike, you are so welcome. And Wesley asks, is there a way to connect a LinkedIn company page that I am an admin of versus my personal LinkedIn page? Thank you for this feedback, or thank you for this question. I don't believe so as of right now, but do me a favor, email support@podbean.com. That is support@podbean.com. They would have a little bit more information on the roadmap of that. And if it's something that we don't offer as of right now, which I don't believe we don't, they would be able to give you the reason as to why we don't, or this would be submitted as a feature request for us. And should a newer or small podcast share download statistics in their media press kit, or would growth rate be enough? I'd say both. I would absolutely say both. Here's what I'll tell you, and this is something that we talk about pretty frequently just across the podcast community. Don't be ashamed of what you think your numbers are. I can't tell you how many people have over the last course of the time that I've been with the company have said, oh, I'm not really getting this downloadership, and they give me a number, and I'm like, that's really good. One of the reasons we put those download badges out is because you should always be proud of the amount of work that you're putting into your podcast. And the thing is, you don't want to overinflate your numbers either. You know, if you're getting, let's say, 100 listens a week, you don't want to all of a sudden say, oh, we're getting 1,000 if it's not true. Now, that being said, with your dashboard analytics through Podbean, you have access to view all the listenership from your RSS feed. That won't count anything that's a separate exported video. So there's nothing wrong with, in your media press kit, calculating all those together. So let's say you have 300 listeners a month on your podcast, but you have 1,000 listeners over on YouTube. That's absolutely accurate. You can put those two together. You know, that is a download number. That's totally fine. But I think putting a growth rate is great also, especially if, like you said, you're a smaller podcast and a newer podcast. You have the ability to show them, hey, if we've only been going for a month or two, look at the growth that we've had. I don't see that being an issue whatsoever. Good question. And Nidra, oh, thank you so much. And Robert asks, also, as with music, do you need to have copyright for the written word? Like if you want to read excerpts from books on your podcast, the best thing I will say is become familiar with fair use. When it comes to copyright, I really can't give too much legal information on that. That being said, there is if you actually go to our group called Podcasting Smarter on Facebook, there's a person in there named Gordon Firemark, who is a podcast attorney, entertainment attorney, but he really focuses on podcasting. He's a great resource for questions like that. He's always open to answering any questions. Look him up. Again, Gordon Firemark. He's awesome, and he could probably get you a little bit more information on that. And I'm going to answer one more question, and then we will bring this to a close here. Candia asks, how can I determine which social media platform is driving the most listeners to my podcast? It's a very good question. So there's a few different things that you can do. There is something that you can do, which is when you post to different podcast episodes and you have that link that you post on social media, you can create what's called a tracking code. And if you have Google Analytics set up, you can put a little tracking code at the end of your URL. This you'd have to Google, but you can put that tracking at the end of that URL. And what you'll be able to do is you can put specific social media platforms. So it'll ask you where's this target? And you could say Facebook, Twitter. So you can really see how much traffic is coming from one specific place over another. And I know that could be a little bit difficult sometimes because these channels are great, these social medias are awesome, but they don't give you a lot of flexibility to see outgoing traffic. So I understand what you're looking to do. Definitely look into it. If you Google tracking URL for Google or Google tracking URL, you'll be able to get all the information you need on how to set that up. And with that, we are at the end of our webinar here. Thank you all so much for being part of our webinar today. Thank you for making the time. I know we've all got a lot of crazy things that we're doing day to day, hour to hour. So thank you all for hanging out with us. I hope you learned a good bit about how to promote your podcast. We hope to see an upcoming webinar. Again, if you liked what you saw, feel free to post us over on the social medias. We will retweet you. Have a great day and happy podcasting, everybody.